It is really a pleasure and an honor to be here. And I want to let you know, as somebody who is an opera scholar, oh gosh, I'm trying to handle all my chords, and who thinks about things, I very rarely get to be on a panel where I have three people of color, three black folks talking about opera, going deep into it. So you are witnessing an historic, wonderful event. Yes. I guess it would help if I use this. So I have the fun honor of having a conversation, and then we're going to hear another piece of music, but we will also at the end open this up to questions. So I don't want to appear like I'm being rude and not paying attention to you guys. It's just so wonderful to begin to get to speak with Maestro and Tazewell Thompson, who I've known for a while now, and also I'm just beginning to get to know Michael Ingram. So I wanted to talk about your experiences with Porgy and Bess from your specific vantage points. And the fact we heard their bios, you've got the bios, and yet it's such an opera, and you can talk about sort of how it's fraught, or whether it's an opera you've always loved or an opera that you hadn't paid much attention to. I mean, Tazewell, the cat's out of the bag. We know you've directed this opera many, many times. But I'm interested, and you can speak in either order, but with you, and I'm loving this where I get to call you Maestro, even though I'm not one of the singers. But you are somebody who's had this incredible position in Hamburg, in Germany. You've been in Germany for about,
12 years.
For 12 years, since 2010. And what you've done as a composer, you're also, as a conductor, you're also a composer, is that with the German system, where they do a wonderful job with funding the arts, you're in a company where you've got like 7, sometimes 9 works simultaneously going on in your brain. And one day you're doing one, a few days later you're doing another. It's just incredible. Though some of you might have, and I know we have some singers here, have sung with conductors. Many of us have not done that so regularly, but the actual sort of all the preparation for what goes into being a conductor. Even if it's a short answer, because I know we talked a little bit about this before, and Tazewell, I'll get to you in a moment. How are you approaching Porgy? What is it like as a conductor, bringing all this experience you've had where you're breathing, embodying, because conducting is such a kinesthetic thing. What is it like from your vantage point?
Yeah, it's a great pleasure to be with you this evening, and this is my first time in Des Moines, first time at Des Moines Metro Opera, and I was actually invited to come last summer, and it just didn't work out because I was busy overseas, but I'm glad that they came knocking again, and for such an incredible piece as Porgy and Bess. As Dr. André mentioned, I'm a Kapellmeister in Germany, and so that means I get to do all sorts of different things in an opera house, and composing, conducting, working with singers, ballet dancers, spoken theater actors, and working on opera, operetta, musical theater. It's like a buzzing beehive of all of these different art forms happening in the same place at the same time. It's an incredible place. And the other extraordinary thing about Germany is that if you start at any given opera house on the map, you can drive 30 minutes or an hour in any direction and you'll get to the next opera house. There's a density of culture there which is unparalleled anywhere else in the world. And even so in America, to have opera at a place like Indianola, which is quite small, this is really exceptional. In Germany, that's normal. There are small towns of 20, 25, 30,000 people that have full-time opera companies, full-time ballets, and it's just a remarkable place to live. So yeah, what does it mean to be a conductor for a piece like this? It's, as you said, it's kinesthetic. So it's, first spending a lot of time getting the sounds in your mind, and then the real moment of truth is when you finally get to start working with the singers and getting to get the piece in your body. I'm doing it for the first time, and so it's such a great pleasure to share this project with Tazewell, who's done it very many times. So we had incredible conversations, and I think we're learning from each other. I'm learning from his experience, and he's learning from all of my crazy questions as a first timer with the piece. Yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna jump in here and say, okay, we gotta back it up. I have a 13-year-old, and she is always giving me these great talks. So you just sort of skipped over the part of how do you get to know an opera? How do you do this? You just sort of look at it. No, and I'm asking this. I can just look at it. It doesn't happen that way. And sort of behind this, I had the great fortune to be at a conductor's retreat, sort of talking about diversity and equity and issues of inclusion last summer at Madomic in Maine. Ken Kiesler's a program he's been running for 25 years, and it was there working with young conductors. Some were in graduate school, some have been choral conductor, like in their churches, but we're moving into it more. And it's like, wait a minute, I've been a singer for fun, and I follow a conductor, but I have no idea what goes into it. Can you just tell us a little bit, what do you do? How do you get it in your body?
Yeah, there are various stages and various components. I often do a lot of singing and playing, and part of my job at a theater involves not just conducting, but often coaching and really getting the hands-on of the pieces that I'm doing.
Are you a singer?
I'm not, although I do sing sometimes, because in front of the orchestra you can spend hours explaining how you want them to play, but it's much easier if you just sing it the way that you want it, and then they immediately understand what you're getting at.
And so you sing flute, you sing all their roles.
Yeah,
oh
yeah.
Lord. Wow.
And so it's partly playing and singing, but also just a lot of reading and looking at the score and trying to understand what the composer was getting at. And then with a piece that is as well documented as Porgy and Bess, a lot of listening, because there's an incredible recorded history going right back to the earliest productions and the earliest casts up to a production like The Met, just from very recently. And it's fascinating to see how the piece has evolved. And one of the questions you had on the slide earlier was, is this piece a musical or is it an opera? And for the first 40, 50 years of its existence, it was really only performed in Broadway-type theaters. Although, interestingly enough, Europe immediately recognized it as an opera. And when it went over on tours with people like Leontyne Price in the leads, it was performed at opera houses, not at musical theaters. So Europe was much more awake and alive to what was in the piece than America was at that point. But to hear a piece evolve that was considered a musical for half a century and then moved into the world of opera, it's really, really telling. Partly, as soon as it starts being considered an opera, it gets slower and heavier and longer and more serious, because opera is a very serious matter. If you listen to the earliest recordings, there's an incredible live recording from the 50s in Berlin with Leontyne Price, and they race through the piece. It's like a stick of dynamite. It's so powerful, and you hear the stagecraft and the laughter and the background noise, and then you compare it with later recordings from the 70s and 80s produced as serious operas, and it's you miss the joy, and you miss the energy, and you miss the stagecraft. And as far as recordings go, when a Broadway musical is recorded, they're taking the cast, which is performing 8 nights a week, they're stealing the cast, they're putting them in a studio for a day or two, they're performing the piece in the studio, and then they're right back on stage. So you hear the stagecraft, and you hear that these are people who've been working together maybe for a year or more, acting together. And with studio opera recordings, it's usually not that way. It's people being flown in from around the world who maybe have never acted the piece together before, and it can often be a kind of sterile, controlled environment, which is very far from stagecraft. And I am passionate about stagecraft. And so in our conversations, we've talked about how important it is for us to have that live, dynamite, dynamic, energetic, restless, rowdy feeling on stage in our production, rather than the pure, pristine, clean, heavy, serious version that you often hear from the more operatic recordings of the piece.
Oh my goodness, that is so amazing. So how did you do this research? Can we go on YouTube and look up stuff?
Oh, I did all the things. YouTube, Spotify, archival recordings, Apple, wherever there's a recording of Porgy and Bess, I tried to find it and listen and devour it and just listen, who are these singers, what are they getting at, what's going on with the stagecraft, what are the different versions, because there are versions that last an hour and an hour and a half, there are versions that last all day.
Right. Thank you so much. I just, it is such a treat for me as a scholar who's usually, doing my nerdy thing to talk, what is it like to actually do this? Moving on to Tazewell, you are somebody who has a very long history with Porgy and Bess. As we heard, and as in our materials, it's all over the world, literally. But you also have different relationships to the theater. And I don't know about most recently, but I know because I was very fortunate to work with you and Janine and Glimmerglass as Blue was being written and workshopped. Now that you've been a director, you've written plays, now you've written a libretto for an opera. Yes, you have your world of Porgy, of directing that, but you're a different person than you were the first time you directed Porgy, because now you've sort of been in opera in a new way. Does that make any difference? I mean, I know it's you, but are you thinking, what is it like now that you have written words and the story to put it together?
Well, I understand what's underneath the words, what the music does in terms of filling out the words, much more than I did when I first encountered Porgy and Bess, which was 24 years ago. My first production was in Paris at the Bastille, and then I did another production at Teatro Real in Madrid. And it was like putting on a play for me, but there was music. And now, yes, you're right, after all the Porgies, and I've done at least 24 Porgies in 4 different productions, and 2 were broadcast on television. And yes, having written now a libretto for an opera, there's so much more that I not just understand, but that I appreciate and that I am acknowledged and I'm grateful for. I've always, though, felt that way, I think, since I was a child, but I understand it even more so. As a child, I grew up in a convent run by Dominican nuns. I was taken away from my parents because of their criminal behavior and criminal background. And my grandmother stepped in. I was 7 years old. And I was sent upstate New York, Blauvelt, Rockland County, St. Dominic's Convent. And I was terrified because, here I was this black kid, and there was maybe 3 or 4 others, and hundreds of kids, and these white women in habits. And so it was frightening. And for a year, I did not speak. And so Father Farrell, who was the head of the convent, and Sister Thomasita, and Sister Dalmatia, these wonderful
incredible
sister names, I know. They thought something was wrong with me, and indeed there was. I didn't speak. I read everything. I wrote a lot, even at that age, but I could not speak to anyone. I was so traumatized. I was taken on a tour of Rockland State Hospital. If you don't know what that is, just by the name of Rockland State Hospital, where I saw various rooms of men and women who were in padded cells, some who were chained or tied to their beds. They were hoping, these nuns, that I would be shocked and start to speak. It didn't happen. So. However, Sister Benvenuta, who came every Tuesdays and Thursday mornings to teach music and taught me and the 29 other students in class how to read music. She came in with a metal trolley that was filled with long playing records. She called them her long playing dreams. And it was all opera. She wanted to be in the world of opera. And her parents said, absolutely not. You're a woman. You're going to get married, or you're going to be a nurse or a secretary. The world of opera, absolutely not. So she ran away and she became a nun. And so she wrote to the men and women of Longines Symphonette Society and said, I have a classroom filled with children who love classical music. And she said, and she's, wrote this incredible letter, and she read it to us, and she says, class, is it all right that I write this? I don't want, you agree that I should sign my name, and I'll send it around, and you can all sign it. So she kept getting these wonderful records. And it was all, she wanted only opera. So that must have given the Longines Symphonette Society some inkling something is wrong, but it didn't. So every Tuesday and Thursday she came in, she would tell a little bit of the background story of the opera. And for many in the class, it was a time to take a nap. For me, I was riveted. I was so entranced by all of these stories of a woman who jumped off a balcony rather than marry the man that she was supposed to marry, or stab someone in the back, or a woman who was in the square and she was singing about the joys of life, and bohemians starving in an artist's galley. I was just loved all of these stories. And so she would play selections, and then she would talk about it, and she'd play another selection, and then she would, teach us how to read music. And I thought I would never, ever have that in my life again. She began to see that I had an interest in not just music, but opera. And one day she said, Mr. Thompson, and I was always called, we were always called by our last names. For about 7 years, I forgot I had a first name, because it was always Mr. Thompson, and it depended how Mr. Thompson was said, whether you were in trouble or not. So anyway, I was taken to her office one day, and it was not a Tuesday or a Thursday, so I thought, oh God, what did I do? And she opened up her office, and on one side, I'd never been inside of her office, it was filled with her long playing dreams. And she took one down and she said, this is going to, I think, really interest you, Mr. Thompson. And she put down the needle, and it was Leontine Price singing from Porgy and Bess. It was extraordinarily moving. And it was just a transformation. And so now it was Mondays and Wednesdays at 2:30 in the afternoon, I would go to her office. I would sit outside waiting for her to come from her other classes, and she would play another selection from Porgy and Bess. And then we graduated to I would hear selections of other operas sung by Paul Robeson, and then Leontine Price. So this went on, and then she said, now I'm going to play something that is going to be a little risque. And I said, well, what? She said, well, there's this young woman. She trained at Juilliard, and she went also to another conservatory, but she never got a break. And this is new. But she's also singing something from Porgy and Bess, but in a very different way. And this singer was singing I Loves You, Porgy. And it was, guess who?
Nina Simone?
Nina Simone singing Porgy. And it was in her own style and her own arrangement.
Wow.
And Sister Benvenuta said to me, now you see, the world of opera can be very interpretive. And Porgy and Bess can have its own kind of meaning and flavor and interpretation, depending who's singing it and what is happening inside of them as they sing it. Now, years went by, and I thought, well, I'm never going to have anything to do with opera. I've left the convent. I'm now in high school, and I have other ideas about what I might do in the world. And I was in plays in high school, and I was part of the newspaper team and debate club and the French club because I learned Latin while I was at St. Dominic's and I was an altar boy. All of these languages came very easy to me when I started to work in opera in other languages. And then suddenly, not suddenly, but years later, I was called to Houston. I've been directing several operas, and I was, at this point, knew that I was going to be a director in theater and opera. I worked for a while as an actor, and after I appeared in a couple of plays, 2 of them on Broadway, the only roles that were offered to me were roles of a drug addict or a pimp or an attacker or a low-life criminal. And so I no longer was interested in the world of the theater in terms of being an actor. And I taught school for a while. I was head of various theater departments. But I discovered that it's directing that really interests me. Anyway, I was called to Houston to look at a production of Porgy and Bess. And when Naomi, when Dr. André speaks of stereotypes that can creep into Porgy and Bess, I saw it in this production. And it really is, it's about what the producing company and especially the director's point of view, how they see the characters in Porgy and Bess, the kind of story they want to tell. And this was outrageously wrong-headed. I stayed and I watched the production, I took copious notes. I gave the notes over to the producer, and I decided, well, this is not for me. I'm on my way home. They offered me to stay on and give more notes. I says, well, there's so much work to do, we'll be here forever. So they let the director go and they hired me. Wow. I didn't know at the time that the production was scheduled to go to San Francisco, Los Angeles, Boston, and all of those companies had pulled out because they saw a rehearsal like I saw a rehearsal, and suddenly they were back in again, which was a launch of my involvement with Porgy and Bess in a very, very different way. And I love the opera. I understand it, I appreciate it, and I see, like Nina Simone, that there are various approaches to I Loves You, Porgy, or the lovely voice that we just heard with Summertime. And when Maestro and I, when we had our Zoom meeting, when we were planning that we knew we were going to be here in Indianola at the Des Moines Metro Opera Company, and he reminded me in that recording that he played for me that there's noise in Porgy and Bess. In the funeral scene, yes, there are those moments where there are solos that come out when they're expressing their grief, but there's also the noise that happens in a funeral, the keening and the sobbing that can happen in the hurricane, and the horror of Bess coming into the funeral for Robbins, Serena, and the others who react to this woman wearing a red dress coming in to pay her respects to Robbins, whom she doesn't know, but she's accompanying Porgy. And it's all throughout. It's in the crap game. It's as a new member comes into Catfish Row, when the vendors come in, when they're praying for Bess's recovery. There's what I call the noise. Of course, it's not really that, but that's my cue word to the singers, that there should be this liveliness, this being alive and expressing their grief, expressing their humor, their jealousies, their moments of reconciliation. When I think of Porgy and Bess, though, altogether for me, it's about the community. And when we say there's a chorus or an auxiliary chorus in Porgy and Bess, it's never that for me. It's the denizens of Catfish Row. And they are all individual people. And hopefully, my aim, my goal is that when you see Porgy and Bess in July 1st when it opens, and I think it has 7 different performances, you will see different personalities on stage who all come together to support Serena, who miss and grieve Jake and Clara, who root against Crown, who have a love and hate affair with sport and life, who admonish Porgy at times, and at times they embrace him, and then they don't understand him, and then they fear that he's really going to go to New York on his own to find Bess. So it's a great mixture. There's nothing homogeneous about this opera. It's colorful, it's vivid, it's dark, it's funny, it's jazzy, it's gospel-like, it's blues-like. I think the Gershwins did a tremendous job in forming this now American masterpiece. 6 years ago, I directed a play at NYU grad school, and it's one of the rehearsal spaces is on 2nd Avenue, and it's between 5th and 6th Street. And you go upstairs to one of the studios where the grad students will rehearse a play. And outside of the door of this particular studio, it said, "This is where George and Ira Gershwin worked for months on Porgy and Bess."
Oh my
It was
God.
astonishing. There's a plaque there. And then there are photos of them in this studio where I was about to rehearse a play where they worked on Porgy and Bess. So this opera has been following me. and Michael Eagle he kept bringing me back to that. I said, no more Porgy. I love it, but I've done Porgy, but there it is. I think it will always be in my life. And I love that it is, and I'm really happy to bring it to all of you here in Indianola.
Thank you. Thank you. Of course, I just want to stay here and talk for like another 3 hours. But I know we can't do this. Is this probably a good time to move to
Don't you have another singer?
We actually get another performance, and then we'll be back and we'll be able to take questions and have more of a conversation.
So
questions? I was going to give them a little warning. They could
There.
think of it.
What tend to be the things that are eliminated from the 4-hour productions? Do they fall into a general category, or is this totally director's choice?
I know some, but I'm sure Naomi knows a lot more than I do. You never see the Archdale scene,
No.
ever. And that's an interesting scene. A man comes in and he's saying, I'm looking for Porgy. And here the community, they're all for Porgy. There's, oh, Porgy, who's Porgy? There's no Porgy in this neighborhood.
So Archdale is a white lawyer who has a relationship with, is it Porgy, Serena's family?
Serena's family, and it's, well, you say. You go on.
Well, so he was, I think he had been sort of owners of her ancestors. And so he's what we don't have in this, a friendly white presence. But he certainly holds some power. And so, yes, that is the scene where he comes in and he's asking sort of where Porgy is.
And they don't give him any information because they said, ooh, lawyer, insurance, no.
They don't trust
We don't
him.
want anything like. And then when they say, well, there might be some money involved. Oh, you mean Porgy who lives, oh yes, we know him.
Oh, we know
I'm his
exactly.
best friend, and he's right over there. So that is sometimes eliminated. The buzzard song.
Right. The buzzard song is a song for Porgy that is it comes late in the opera. Porgy is a big role, and this is a complicated aria to sing. I think it just lies in a part of the voice that's heavy. It's late in the evening, and it sort of shows the superstition of Porgy that we get in the novel a bit, sort of coming out of this time where the buzzard is this, bad things are going to
Foretelling.
happen. And we see that taken up where Porgy doesn't want to look at Crown because he's afraid that sort of the superstition element that if he looks at Crown after, when nobody thinks that he as a disabled man could have killed Crown, even though he did. Sorry, I'm giving all the stories away. But he is brought to jail to look at Crown, to identify Crown, the body. And Porgy is superstitious that because he's there and looking at a dead man, that his eyes will start bleeding.
Yes. I happen to like the buzzard song, and I in several productions, I included the buzzard song. I like it. It has a significance in the opera because there is this, when the buzzard flies over, it means bad luck, bad fortune, something terrible is going to happen. And indeed it does.
Yeah.
So it gives that, but also the scene prior to that is a scene that is usually left in, and it's good that it's left in this production because Simon Estes is playing it, Lawyer Fraser, and then after the Lawyer Fraser scene is the buzzard scene, followed by the scene with Sport and Life. And so I thought...
And Mariah, is that?
Yes.
Ah.
And so I thought, well, if we have to, let's eliminate the buzzard song for perhaps this production. But then 5 days ago, unbeknownst to Michael Eagle, unbeknownst to Maestro, I called and spoke to our Porgy here, Kevin Diaz. And I said, what do you think about the buzzard song? Because I wanted to ask Porgy first. And he says, well, I've performed it, but he says, I can no longer trust myself because it really lies in a higher register. And we talked about it, we communicated back and forth in email, and we both understood the significance of it, but we'll keep it out for this time. But that's one of the songs that is eliminated from Porgy and Bess, and there are others.
I'd love to add one more perspective to answer your question, and that is the way that musical theater composers work is so different from the way that classical composers work. Usually a classical composer might retire to a villa in Italy or Switzerland for a couple of years and then come back to the world as if he were coming down from Mount Sinai to present this sacred work in all of its perfect splendor, which should never be touched or adjusted in any way. And composers like Wagner worked that way. But the Gershwins, these were songwriters and Broadway composers. And in the Tin Pan Alley tradition, they could write a tune a minute. They worked so fast. And so the score of Porgy is an embarrassment of riches. And the Gershwins it never would have occurred to them to do a complete version of all of the material, because for every musical composer up to the present day, they write and rewrite and rewrite and rewrite, and then they do a workshop and they write again, and then they do another workshop or a reading and then they write again, and they preview out of town. And in the out of town previews, the production company, production team, including the composer and lyricist, they sit in the back of the hall every night for weeks on end, and they watch the show with the audience and through the eyes of the audience. And according to the audience reaction, they'll have a meeting after the show at 11 or midnight, and they'll talk through what they saw, and they'll say, okay, there was a little bit of problem with the energy and the flow in the second act, what should we do? They'll come up with a plan. The composer will stay up all night and write something new, present it to the producers the next morning. They'll call the singers in at 10, teach it to them musically, call the director at 12 to stage it, call the choreographer at 2, and then they'll put it in that night in the show in a piano version. And then they'll watch again and see if it works. If it doesn't work, they'll repeat the process. If it does work, then the Kapellmeister or the conductor or orchestrator will stay up the whole night orchestrating it, and then it will be in the show. And this process happens over and over hundreds of times as the piece is being developed. So it's a fundamentally collaborative way of working, and no one is precious with their material in the world of Broadway. They know that even if this is a great song that I've written, if it doesn't work in the flow of the piece, it's out and we create something new. And so when the Gershwins were working on this opera, they were writing an opera, but they did not discard their way of working from the world of Broadway, from Silver Age Broadway. So they were just writing and writing and writing and throwing stuff out and putting new stuff in and rearranging. And I think of another famous musical, Fiddler on the Roof. You know, there are 24 songs that never made it into the version of Fiddler on the Roof that we know, just to give you an idea of how much material these composers were generating that ends up on the cutting room floor. And so because this piece is now being considered an opera, we have these complete critical editions where we can actually see sometimes reconstructed versions of all of the things that were cut. And so it's amazing to have the privilege and the liberty to see it all and to choose how to piece our version together. And when we do the piece again in a couple years, let's say in Germany, we'll revisit all of our cuts and we'll rearrange and we'll pick a new version. And then when we do it again in our tour of Southeast Asia, we'll revisit it again.
You know, Michael is so right that I love that he told this story about how, you know, the Gershwins and other musical theater people would put together. It's so true. You know, when you watch those wonderful Broadway, Hollywood films on TCM, and you see them working on a musical, and then they're up all night, and just exactly how they describe, you look and you says, oh, well, that only happens in the movies. No. Maestro is absolutely right. That is exactly what happens. And that's how the Gershwins put together Porgy and Bess, just as described.
How involved was Ira Gershwin after the death of George in some of those rewrites, do you think? Do you have any proof?
That is a really good question, and there is some Porgy and Bess research that is out there. John Andrew Johnson, I don't know, I know that was a dissertation. I don't know if it became a book, but there, and I think Noonan, who has a big book on Porgy and Bess, but I don't think she talks about too much with all the cuts. There is the critical edition that is, I don't think it's published and available yet, but I know, and this was what happened at the University of Michigan. The Gershwin Initiative worked with Wayne Shirley, who'd been working on the critical edition for years, trying to trace all the different parts of it and say, and so there's no one version of Porgy. And this gives great context that is actually not a bad idea, because that hooks into the tradition in which the Gershwins were from. I know that Ira Gershwin at one point, and this is sort of an interesting, this came up in the performance. I was involved with the performance of the critical edition when it was the University of Michigan, where the Gershwin Initiative is, and the Met was getting ready, and so this was to make sure all the notes sort of worked together. So there is the N-word, referring to African Americans, was in an early version of Porgy and Bess. And then Ira Gershwin went out and took that out and sort of would say, sort of you dummy, or you know, instead of using this expletive. It seems that in looking at all the materials, there was one place where and it's thought he just missed it. But there was a big question, do we actually use that in the performance of the critical edition that was, you know, almost 4 hours of music? And they asked me, and I said, I don't think you need to do this. He cut every other case out. It would cause a lot of pain. If you want to put a special note that you've done this, but I don't think anyone will miss it. There's so much going on. So the types of cuts and stuff is interesting. So we know, and I don't know the full history, but I know that Ira was working on it a little bit. Cheryl Crawford was somebody who did several performances. I'm looking to see if, I know in the 40s, that sort of cut it down, and that was in the phase of it being, I think it's a 1943 production, where it was more in the musical theater version, and spoken and sort of leaner and meaner, or not meaner, but, you know, like more compact. So it's a great question, and the critical edition should, you know, as a musicologist, even though I hear what you're saying, it's like, no, don't cut stuff out. But it's okay to cut it out if that's part of the performance practice. But the musicologist in me just wants to make sure we have all the music so we can take a look at it and sort of see, because what an exciting experience to sort of see how they're putting together their first full-length opera, and an opera that has staying power and has become such an important early sort of a great American opera. So excellent question there.
My question
Yeah.
is there a huge difference in audience reaction if Porgy is performed in Europe or in the Deep South, say? Or you're doing this one in the Midwest, and I'm a very Midwestern sort of guy, but that's my question. How you perceive the audience reaction?
That's a good question, very good question. And yes, there is a difference. I directed Porgy and Bess in, one of the productions was in Osaka, and another one in Tokyo. And the moment the singers arrived on stage, when the curtain went up, the audience couldn't stop applauding.
Wow.
They hadn't even sung a note yet. But it was so familiar to them that they were going to hear Summertime. So when Clara started to sing Summertime, they, you know, and the other thing I should say is Asian audiences, they do not applaud until the end at anything. So this was highly unusual. So Clara started to sing Summertime, and she's singing it gorgeously, as wonderfully as our singer just sang it. And as she starts to go into the second part of it, the audience was singing along.
Oh my God.
And so then
in Japanese or in English?
Well, in English, in English. And so it was the most astonishing. This was in Osaka. We couldn't believe it. And so then it went on, and then there's a line where Jake says, "Oh, give me that baby, I can stop her from crying. Give him to me." And so a woman is a sometimes thing. And then you see the audience. It was unbelievable. Finally, we had to put a stop to it. So finally, there's someone, I guess, with the head of the Osaka, I forget the name of the theater, it's a very long name of the theater starting with a B, ran down the aisle and held, said, "Lights, no, 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 no." And admonished them in Japanese. And then, so for the rest of the opera, and then at the end, of course, they took endless curtain calls, endless and endless curtain calls. And then some of us, we were, out shopping, or or at a restaurant, a huge crowd, Porgy Bess, Porgy Bess, Porgy Bess. So yes, there's that difference.
If I had been conducting that production, by the way,
you would have.
I would not have shushed the audience. I probably would have turned around and conducted them too.
Oh, wow.
And in Teatro Real in Madrid, the audience went crazy. Nothing like in Osaka, crazy for Porgy and Bess. I was in South Africa, in Cape Town. I was there as a consultant. I didn't have it on my schedule that I could direct Porgy and Bess, and I really wanted to do it there. But I came in and gave notes, and I watched the opening performance. Again, the audience, they knew the songs. They wanted so much to sing along, and some of them you could hear them humming or moving, and some of them were conducting in the audience. It was a wonderful experience. Here in the States, the audiences know you don't come late for an opera, otherwise you'll come in at the first seating break, and you behave yourselves, and you watch it. And I don't think whether it's the South, or because I've directed in the South and certainly in the New York, Boston area, Virginia, audiences love it, and it was described once by a critic that the lure and the popularity of Porgy and Bess, especially for box office, and the Metropolitan Opera will never admit this, nor will New York City Opera, most opera companies will admit, they do Porgy and Bess because they know the box office is going to be a tremendous, they can add as many performances as they need to because it will really sell at the box office. So this critic described it as the Christmas Carol of opera, or the, what's the ballet that's the Nutcracker, or the Nutcracker of opera. Of course, that's not why Michael Eagle chose it at all. No, seriously, he really loves this opera, and we had wonderful discussions. He treats this opera with great deal of respect, and we had, I had said no to him originally, several times, but the more I spoke to him, I could see his warmth, his generosity, his openness, and his real respect that he wanted to bring something unique to this community, and I'm so happy that I got to meet Maestro, that I'm working with my friend again, and that we have a magnificent company.
I have a question.
Yes.
Well, one of the reasons I came to here tonight is because I just really wanted to know how we're treating operas that have some potentially problematic material in them. And you alluded to Madame Butterfly, and that's just my question is, what are we doing now? How are we dealing with all this problematic material that comes from opera? The racism, so much sexism.
Yeah.
And younger people coming up, they don't tolerate it like we
You were right.
So what are we doing? And I love it. I am so impressed by what Des Moines Metro Opera is doing with this production and bringing you on and having this discussion. Love it. Way to go.
Oh, I'm so glad to hear you say that, and thank you for asking that question, because we have inherited a tradition that is complicated. And it's, as somebody who loves to bring people to the opera, then when I bring them to something that has incredible music, one of my favorites is Don Giovanni. Yet in the first few moments, it's depending on the staging, this could be just, incredibly triggering and traumatic for someone. Sometimes it's triggering for me, and I know this works so well. I think the best thing that companies can do is to not ignore it, but to say, all right, first of all, is this music that we want to continue? And we get to say, is this something that we think stands the test of time? Just because something was popular in the past doesn't mean we have to do it again. Does it work? And if we say, yeah, this is a masterpiece, this is incredible music, okay, this is a product of its time, how do we give context to it? And to say, hey, there are some problems. I think it would be irresponsible, and I say this very much as somebody who's a scholar in residence also at Seattle Opera, which is known for doing a lot of Wagner, and they're bringing back Tristan, or they're doing a Tristan in the next season. And it would be irresponsible not to talk about these issues around Wagner and anti-Semitism, Wagner as he was used in the 20th century, and sort of what that music comes to mean. Do I think Wagner is an incredibly important, gorgeous composer? Absolutely. But as a lot of us we can hold contradictory thoughts in our mind. When is it time to cancel a composer? I don't know. And I think that needs to be a group discussion by each community. I don't think there's one size that fits all. But I'm really excited to work with Seattle. I haven't worked with them when they've done Wagner and then we've had the pandemic come on. But I have a lot of friends. Maybe I have a lot of friends who just tell me, I don't like this, I don't like that. But a lot of friends who have problems with Wagner, and I think that is something we need to talk about. And I would be the last person to say we can't do Wagner. So I don't know if that's a helpful answer, but when is it? I think we need to talk about these things. I think it needs to be a community decision. What people do in Des Moines might be different than what people do in Bayreuth, might be different than what people do in Heifetz. But as long as we can open up communication and try to see what are the ultimate goals. One of the things about the arts, and particularly with opera, is that it shows us how to be human. And if we feel we're being dehumanized by it, well then I think some adjustments need to be done.
I think it's unfortunate that there are opera companies who are canceling, already in their subscription, already announced, any opera that's written by a Russian composer.
Oh, yes.
Because of what's going on in Ukraine. I think that's terribly unfortunate.
Yes.
And so when you think of Wagner, when you think of any brilliant Russian composer, I think there needs to be this discussion. We do need to come together like we're doing tonight, and we need to talk about the issues that operas, the stories in operas present. I mean, I was 7, 8 years old, and I was hearing about rape and assassination, and the Baroque Julius Caesar. It was just startling to me, but I couldn't get enough of it. It was wonderful. Bring it on. But it is too bad that there is this cancel culture, not just by Russian composers, but there are some universities that wouldn't even have Dr. André on now because she's talking about race, and she's talking about women's issues. So I congratulate all of you that you want to know, you want to come and listen, you want to delve deep, you want to experience, you want context, you want to see these characters that might have been described to you as one-dimensional and see, no, is there really something underneath it all? So I applaud you and I salute you for coming tonight and hearing what we have to say, especially Dr. André and
Especially
Maestro.
all
Yes.
of you.
Yeah, Porgy has the unique privilege or misfortune of having always been poked at and prodded at, and people have been trying to deal with its various issues from the beginning, and from the beginning many people in the Black community just rejected the opera out of hand and really were troubled or disgusted by it. What I hope in our time and moving forward is not that we stop poking and prodding at Porgy and its issues and discussing them. I hope that we let more operas join the club, because opera as a genre is problematic by its very nature, because it's always about vice. Without vice, you have no plot. So every opera is about...
That's right.
But if you have people who are happy and respectful and don't bother each other, there's no plot. So every opera, even comic operas, it's about murder, it's about deception, it's about sexual abuse and harassment, it's about poison, it's about daggers. And so that's what creates plot.
Conflict.
That's what creates conflict, exactly. And also opera from the very beginning. So opera, the genre is invented in around 1600 in Florence. From the very beginning, opera was often created by European composers looking at cultures they considered exotic And you can call it being inspired by the cultures or appropriation. There are all different ways to look at that. But Bizet, a Frenchman, is writing about Spain. Verdi, an Italian, is writing about a black man called Otello or about a black woman called Aida. And Puccini, an Italian, is writing about a Japanese woman and about a woman in the Wild West. And so opera has always been about composers looking off into places they considered exotic and creating worlds as they imagined them to be, which often just don't connect with reality. And then there's the added layer that in performance history, often those cultures were not consulted or included in the conversation. And recently it made big headlines that the Met was finally doing Otello without blackface. And I thought, well, that's awfully nice, but couldn't we do Otello with an actual black person? So sometimes the product we're making, it's baby steps, but I hope we invite more operas to the club so that next time if maybe the conversation's about Magic Flute or about Tosca and all of those issues, because our experience of opera becomes so much richer when we understand the issues and when we continue to revisit them. Because this conversation would not have been this way 3 years ago, and it wouldn't have been this way 20 years ago or 50 years ago. Every time we reapproach a work, the conversation changes and evolves. And if it doesn't, then that's a work that we stop performing. The works that last are works that survive this constant scrutiny and the layers and just trying to take it apart and put it back together and understand what it means for us today.
I think.
Question.
Sure. Oh, great. Good. Please.
Opera for me is outside my life experience as a genre of music, and since we're talking about all these sensitive topics, I'd be curious to know what you, all three of you, the challenges you face as you have ventured into being a professor, maestro, and then the director. You explained your life experience introduced you to opera at a very young age, but has it been very challenging for all three of you to do what you do?
Well, yes. The rest of that story is when I looked at some of the titles that were in the presentation that Naomi gave, I could see part of my life flashing before me. I was to direct the world premiere of Toni Morrison's Margaret Garner at 3 different opera houses. I don't want to mention the opera houses. They exist and they do very well. I've never worked there because I held what they did to me against them. And I signed a contract. And I came in and we were auditioning singers and we were discussing the opera. And then the questions that I was asked, do you really think that you're capable of directing this opera? And I had already directed dozens of operas. This is quite different, This is written by Toni Morrison, and we're going to place this in your hands. Now, I knew Toni Morrison. I did seminars with her in Princeton where she taught. And I knew Richard Danielpour, who was a professor at Manhattan School of Music. Years later, I ran the opera division at Manhattan School of Music. So this went on and on and on. And then not even having the nerve, the gall, the courage to come to to bring me into a meeting and say, we don't think this is going to happen. I received a note under my hotel door and said, we will be picking you up. Someone will come by and pick you up and take you to the airport. I called my agent and told her what happened, and she said, come home. They'll rue the day that this happened. So they were sued for a very large amount of money. And then, when it was to premiere in New York, at New York City Opera, I was asked to do Toni Morrison's Margaret Garner, which had gone through a lot of changes, and it didn't do actually very well at those particular opera houses. And so, and Toni was extraordinarily embarrassed by that this had happened to me. Her hands were tied because once apparently you signed something over, she couldn't say, well, I'm with, it had all happened so quickly, and they already had another director in place, a Caucasian man. And so there was that. And there are a couple of other operas that appeared up there that, I don't even want to go into right now. But yes, there has been challenges, to answer your question. And it was tough and it was hurtful. And certainly I would know how to approach Amistad, a story about a slave ship. I would certainly know the story of Margaret Garner, and I love the character of Margaret Garner, who murdered her children rather than see them grow up to become slaves. I understood that story. I think many of us in this room can understand both those stories. But as a black man, I certainly could have a very strong and unique point of view. So yes, I've come across that. And then I was to direct my first Dialogues of the Carmelites, my favorite opera, as it turns out, because it's nuns. And I knew the world of nuns. And I remember inviting some of my wonderful nuns from St. Thomas, and they cried through the whole thing before even the guillotine scene at the end, because it was Mr. Thompson who was directing. And I took them backstage during intermission. I said, here are the nuns who are responsible, and that's why I have all these different scenes about putting on the veil and the habit. So, but before I got to do Dialogues of the Carmelites, me, brought up by nuns, I was questioned as if I was in an inquisition. Well, Mr. Thompson, tell us what you know about the Catholic Church and nuns. And well, we're not sure this is going to be the right piece for you, but we'd like to know. Tell us something. Well, I went on and on, of course. But that I would be placed in that position was horrifying to me. So, and I've directed, that's another opera I could direct over and over, is Dialogues of the Carmelites. Another one that I love is Lost in the Stars by Kurt Weill. And Mahagoni is another. So it's my long way of saying yes, that there's been challenges. And there continues to be. There was something else that came up recently, and I was not offered it because they found out that I'm a person of color, I'm a black man. And I said, well, today there's no excuse. You could just type in my name and there I am. Just click images and you'll see a lot of me there. So.
I've been privileged not to have to deal with a lot of the things that you just described. And in Germany, I've mostly been welcomed with open arms into very lively communities inside of opera houses, which I described earlier this evening. And also opera houses, often you'll be in the smaller towns in Germany, you might have a population which has 0.01% foreigners only, but inside of the opera house, every second person is from another country, or sometimes even more. And so it's often just a thriving international community. You hear all sorts of languages going on all the time. And so that can be a very welcoming environment. One subtle thing that I've had to deal with is people listen with their eyes. And often the way that, for me, it comes up in reviews. I stopped reading my German reviews years ago because they just tended to annoy or amuse me. So for example, the very first ballet I did in Germany, it was a classical ballet from the 19th century. I read the review and they said it had this cool bluesy undertone. I said, I'm conducting a German orchestra, a German ballet company in a ballet from whatever, 1830. There's no blues going on here. And I'm certain that if a white German colleague had gone on stage for the curtain call and not me, the reviewer, it never would have occurred to the reviewer to write that. But he saw a black guy come on stage and suddenly he realized, oh yeah, I've been listening to blues for the past 2 hours. And this sort of thing has come up a lot in another production at my theater. I composed incidental music for The Crucible, really powerful production. And I was writing music in the style that would have been sung in the Puritan church of that time in Salem, Massachusetts. And again, the very first commentary I got was, wow, that was some amazing gospel music you wrote. I said, this was a Puritan, 18th century Puritan liturgy that had nothing to do with gospel, but as soon as people see me, they suddenly, what they hear changes, even if they already heard it before they knew who I was. So that's quite a subtle thing. And people who make comments like that, they don't mean me any malice, but it just becomes very clear that what they see makes it difficult for them actually to listen to the music that I'm making, because they have a whole set of ideas about what they will hear or did hear once they see me. But I am very grateful to be living where I am, and I'm very grateful not to have had to deal with a lot of the very blatant aggressions that you just described.
I want to thank you guys for sharing that experience. And very quickly, the lights are in my eyes, so I can't see where that question came from. But unfortunately, yes, these things happen. I'll also say, sort of with my moderator hat on, the types of discrimination are also frequently filtered through the lens of colorism. And for colorism, for those of you who aren't familiar with that term, it's how dark you are. So I'm not surprised that Tazewell would get a whole lot more than I might necessarily get, or Maestro might get. It's a sad, and this is something that's happens with people of color, within groups of people of color, as well as outside. So it's this internalized thing a lot of people feel. Two really quick stories. For the past 20 years, I have been teaching at an institution where I'm not allowed to teach the music majors. I started out in the School of Music, but was seen as being a little too radical because I was talking about gender at that point. And musicology has been a rather conservative, traditional area. So that's been a little unfortunate, but it allowed me to go into, that's why my titles are always so tough. I'm in the departments of Women's and Gender Studies, Afro-American, African Studies, and the residential college. It's because the School of Music kicked me out or excommunicated me. So luckily I've gotten really deep into other things and have learned it and done my best. But I really, at the end of Black Opera, the book I wrote, I include an experience I had with a regional Midwestern orchestra where I was on the board, and I was trying to make some headway with trying to have more diversity. Oh, maybe that's a sign I should stop soon. But and the example I gave was a very true-to-life one where the symphony was playing. They had a Mozart birthday concert every January, and they were doing, sometimes they would do operas, so they did Die Entführung aus dem Serail, The Abduction from the Seraglio, and Southeastern Michigan has the largest population of Middle Eastern people outside of the Middle East. It's something that not everybody knows, but there's a big population there. And it's an opera that is a wonderful, incredible opera, but also has some stereotypes about the Muslim religion. There's one who gets drunk and talks about raping women. And I thought that it would be nice to put something to say, just to contextualize it in its time, and also in Mozart's time, where Turkish and the fear of a Turkish invasion hadn't happened since the 1630s. So when Mozart's writing this in the 1780s, this has gotten to a point where they felt comfortable enough where they could make these sort of Turkish references. And so I wrote some notes, which I actually put in the book. And the follow-up to that is there were some other diversity issues that they were really difficult and resistant to. And I finally spoke up. I was trying to speak with the executive director. I was working with, because I was on the board, they asked me to be on the board. I spoke with a couple of people and I wasn't getting anywhere. And so finally I said to the board, which was about 30 people, I said, I want to let you know that these are issues that we should be discussing, that we need to think about the repertory we're doing, the people in the orchestra, the people behind the scenes. I mean, at that point, I was the only person of color on the board, and it was just an all-white environment. 2 days later, it was the next day, I got a call that said they accepted my resignation. And I said it was, 2 members of the executive board, the treasurer and the president. And I said, wait, I didn't resign. I was saying that there's some issues we got to talk about. We accept your resignation. And then it took me a minute, and I'm like, oh, they've resigned me. And so I was resigned. I didn't get to be there anymore. And I have not gone to those concerts since. So these things, they happen. Oh, I'm the moderator. Okay, so okay, we need something sort of upbeat because this is a group where, and I appreciate your willingness to stay, to ask these questions and to let us think about them and to allow you to see us vulnerable and for you to share with some of this. These are hard topics, but we can do this because, as I love to say, opera has so many goodies. And the goodies need to be shared. And then we have lots of people coming, and it's a wonderful scene. It's a wonderful thing. I want to thank you for leaning in with us. Oh, God, I hate that term. Sorry. We're about to go to our performance. Are there any last words you guys have been amazing. Thank you.
I just want to say one thing for a positive upbeat. Besides everything else that I love to do, I'm a political junkie as well. And I remember that it was Iowa, the state of Iowa.
That's right.
Know what I'm going to say? When Hillary and Barack Obama were, campaigning who is going to be the nominee representing the Democrats, and Iowa, and Obama was not doing well at all prior to Iowa. And Hillary and Bill decided, well, we don't need to go to Iowa. We'll just go to maybe a couple of places. Obama won big in Iowa and changed everything. So, wonderful Iowa, I'm here. Thank you. Boy, do we need him now.
I'm so glad you brought that up. Nobody outside of Iowa really understands how the caucus situation works. So you give us a great model. Thank you so much.
I got plenty of nothing, and nothing's plenty for me. I got no car, I got no mule, got no misery. Oh, folks with plenty, got a lock on the door. Afraid somebody's going to rob them while he's out there making more. What for? I got no lock on the door, that's the way to be. Think it's still the rug on the floor. That's okay with me, cause the days that I prize and the stars and the skies are free. Oh, I got plenty of nothing, and nothing's plenty for me. I got my gal, I got my son, got the head in the whole day long. No use complaining, got my God, got my Lord, got my song. I got plenty of nothing, and nothing's plenty for me. I got the sun, got the moon, got the deep blue sea. God, folks with plenty, gotta pray on a day. It seems with plenty, you sure gotta worry how to keep the devil away. Away. I ain't afraid about hell till the time arrives. Never worry long as I'm well. Never want to strive to be good, to be bad. What the hell? I is glad as alive. Oh, I got plenty of nothing, and nothing's plenty for me. I got my gal, I got my son, got the heaven the whole day long. No use complaining, got my gun.